I still remember the moment I realized I couldn't undo what I'd done. Not the first moment, not the obvious one, not the moment anyone watching this would expect. It was a Tuesday, ordinary, quiet, the kind of day that has no business holding the weight of what landed on it. I was sitting in a room I didn't want to be in, across from a woman I had never met, watching her hands tremble around a cup of coffee she hadn't touched in 20 minutes. She was 73 years old. She had been a nurse for half a century. Emergency rooms, intensive care, the kind of work where you make life and death decisions before your second cup of coffee, and you don't flinch because flinching costs lives. She wasn't fragile. She wasn't foolish. She was one of the strongest people who had ever lived in that small, yet a quiet house with the photographs on the mantel and the golden retriever asleep at her feet. And I had helped destroy her, not with my hands, not directly, not in any way that would ever show up in a courtroom with my name attached. But I was part of it. I was part of the machine. And sitting in that room, hearing her voice crack as she described the man she thought she loved, I understood, for the first time, what I had actually been doing all those years. Not hustling, not surviving, not any of the words I used to dress it up so I could sleep at night. I had been feeding on loneliness, and loneliness is the most abundant resource on earth. Let me be clear about something before I go any further. I am not here to explain how it works. I will not walk you through the steps. I will not name the tools. I will not give you a blueprint. If that's what you came for, leave now. This story will only disappoint you. What I will tell you is what it felt like. What it felt like to sit on the other side of a screen and know with absolute certainty that the person trusting you with their heart was going to lose everything and to keep going anyway. There is a photograph that I think about more than any other. I never held it. I only heard it described. It was taken in 1978. A young woman with dark curly hair standing beside a tall man outside a small church. They are holding hands. Their families are around them. They have just made promises to each other that they will spend the next 45 years keeping. Every single one. She told me about that photograph. Not me, specifically. She told the person she believed she was talking to. A man who didn't exist. A fiction built from stolen images and careful patience and a kind of emotional precision that I once mistook for skill. I don't call it skill anymore. I call it what it is: cruelty. Practiced, patient, deliberate cruelty, aimed at the people least equipped to see it coming. Not because they're stupid, because they're human, because they loved somebody once and lost them, and made the mistake of believing that the world might offer that kind of love a second time. Her name wasn't really Elena. I'm not going to use real names. I'm not going to use real places. I owe her that much, though I owe her far more than I can ever repay. But her story is real, and it is the reason I am sitting here, talking to you, instead of still doing what I used to do. She lost everything. I need you to understand what that word means. Everything. Because people hear it and they think money. They think bank accounts and retirement funds and numbers on a screen. And yes, she lost those things. Hundreds of thousands of dollars. A lifetime of savings built on 50 years of 12-hour shifts and missed holidays, and the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that only nurses understand. But that's not what everything means. Everything means she stopped trusting herself. Everything means she looked at her daughters and saw pity in their eyes and felt a shame so deep it had no bottom. Everything means she sat in her living room at 73 years old and said out loud to a stranger, "The more I look at all this, the more I realize how dumb I am." She wasn't dumb. She was the furthest thing from dumb. She had spent 5 decades making split-second decisions that kept people alive. She had raised a family. She had traveled the world. She had held her husband's hand through a stroke, through dementia, through the slow and merciless unraveling of the only man she had ever loved. She watched him forget her name. She watched him forget his own. And after he died, after 45 years of marriage ended in a hospital room that she herself had worked in, she spent 7 years alone. 7 years. Do you know what 7 years of loneliness does to a person? It doesn't make you weak. It makes you hungry. Not for money, not for excitement, for the simplest, most ordinary thing in the world. Someone to say good morning to. Someone to say good night. That's all she wanted. And that's exactly what made her a target. I knew women like her, not personally, not by name, but I knew the shape of them, the outline, the silhouette of grief that made someone visible to people like me. I knew what a widow looked like from the other side of a screen. I knew what loneliness sounded like in a first message. I knew the difference between someone browsing and someone desperate. And I knew, God help me, I knew that the desperate ones would give you everything if you just said the right things in the right order and waited long enough. That's what haunts me. Not the mechanics, not the money, not the logistics, the patience. The fact that I could sit with someone's loneliness for weeks, months, letting them believe in something beautiful, something healing, something that felt like a second chance at life, knowing the entire time that I was boarding a coffin and calling it a home. If you're still watching this, I want you to sit with something uncomfortable. I want you to think about the person in your life who lives alone, the parent who doesn't talk about their evenings, the aunt who changed her phone background to a picture of someone you've never met, the grandfather who suddenly seems happier but won't tell you why. Think about them, because the thing I understood, the thing I wish I could understand, is that the people most at risk will never ask for help. They will never tell you. They will protect the lie the same way they'd protect a real relationship, with silence, with deflection, with that particular kind of defensiveness that comes from knowing somewhere deep down that something is wrong, but being too afraid to face it. Because facing it means admitting the love wasn't real. And for someone who already lost the love of their life once, that's a death they can't survive twice. I'm going to tell you how I got here. Not the details, not a blueprint. You won't learn how to do what I did from the story, but you learn something worse. You'll learn how easy it is to become the kind of person who does it. And that, more than any scam, more than any stolen dollar, is the thing that should terrify you. Because I wasn't born a monster. I became one small decision at a time. That was the first thing I had to understand, and the last thing I wanted to admit. What came next was the part where I convinced myself it was okay. Nobody wakes up one morning and decides to become a predator. That's the lie people tell themselves. That there's a clean line between good people and bad people. and that the bad ones always knew what they were. It's comforting, that lie. It means you never have to wonder if it could be you. But I'm telling you, from the other side of that line, it could. It could be anyone. All it takes is the right amount of pressure and the wrong people standing next to you when you're at your lowest. I'm not going to tell you where I grew up. I'm not going to name the country, the city, the neighborhood. I owe nothing to the geography. And I won't give anyone the satisfaction of turning this into a story about a place instead of a choice. Because that's what it was, a choice. But I need you to understand the soil that choice grew in. I grew up in a house where the electricity came and went like weather. Some weeks we had it, some weeks we didn't. You learn to do homework by daylight and eat dinner by candle and not complain because everyone on the street was living the same way. My mother worked hard every day, jobs that didn't have titles, just hours, long, punishing hours that bent her back and calloused her hands and paid just enough to keep us hungry instead of starving. My father left before I was old enough to remember his face. I've been told he was intelligent, charismatic even, the kind of man who could talk his way into any room. I suppose I inherited that. I wish I hadn't. There was no money for university. There was barely money for food. Yet the future, as far as I could see it from where I stood, was a long hallway with no doors. You worked, you survived, you got old, you died. That was the trajectory, unless you found another way. I need to be very careful here, because this is the part of the story where people like me, people who did what I did, start building the case for why it wasn't really our fault. The sad backstory, the systemic failure, the lack of opportunity, and all of that is real. The poverty was real. The hopelessness was real. The feeling of being invisible to a world that had already decided your life didn't matter. That was as real as anything I've ever felt. But none of it excuses what I became. I say this now with the clarity that distance gives you. But back then, standing in the middle of it, the math felt different. Back then, the equation was simple. People on the other side of the world had more money than they knew what to do with. I had nothing. And there were people around me, older, respected, successful by every visible measure, who had figured out how to move wealth from their pockets to ours without ever leaving the room. They had phones, laptops, good clothes, cars. They took care of their families. They built houses for their mothers. They were not hiding in shadows. They were walking in daylight, and no one looked away. The first time someone explained it to me, they didn't use the word scam. They didn't use any word that would have triggered the alarm bells that should have gone off in my head. They called it the work. Are you doing the work? He's good at the work. The work is slow this month. Just the work, like construction, like farming, like any other labor that trades time for money. And that framing, that casual, almost boring ordinariness, is what made it so easy to step inside. Because it didn't feel like crossing a line, it felt like opening a door. I want to stop here and say something directly. I am not telling you this to earn your sympathy. I don't deserve it. And I'm not telling you this to explain away what I did. Because there is no explanation that makes it acceptable. I'm telling you this because if you think scammers are masterminds sitting in dark rooms, you've already misunderstood the problem. Most of us were ordinary, painfully unremarkably ordinary. We weren't geniuses. We weren't criminal prodigies. We were young people in impossible situations who found a door that was already open and walked through it because the people we admired were already on the other side. That's the truth. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just human. And that's what makes it so dangerous. The justification came in layers. First, they can afford it. That was the foundation. The bedrock excuse that everything else was built on. These are wealthy people, first world people. They have insurance. They have safety nets. They have governments that protect them. Losing a few $1,000s to them is like losing pocket change. That's what I told myself. That's what everyone around me said. And when you're eating one meal a day and watching your mother come home with her feet swollen and her eyes empty, the logic feels airtight. They have too much. You have nothing. The maths works, except it doesn't. Because the people I eventually hurt were not billionaires on yachts. They were retirees on fixed incomes, widows living alone, grandfathers stretching pensions across months that were too long. There were people exactly like my mother, except born in a different place, under a different sky. But I didn't know that yet, or maybe I did, and I chose not to look. Second layer, it's not violent. This was the one that quieted my conscience the longest. Nobody gets hurt. Not physically, not visibly. There's no blood, no weapon, no bruise. You sit in a room, you type, you talk, and money appears in an account. Clean, quiet, bloodless. That's what I believed. And that belief held firm right up until I sat across from a 73-year-old woman who hadn't slept in 4 months and couldn't look her own daughters in the eye. No blood, but damage so deep it doesn't have a name. Third layer, everyone is doing it. This one is the most insidious because it transforms a crime into a culture. When everyone around you is engaged in the same activity, when it's not hidden, not whispered, but not shameful, the moral weight disappears. It becomes ambient, normal. Just another feature of the landscape, like traffic noise or humidity. You stop asking whether it's right. You start asking whether you're falling behind. I watched people I respected, people who were kind to their families, generous in their communities, faithful in their personal lives, engage in the same work without a flicker of doubt. And I thought, if they can do it and still be good people, then so can I. That's the trap. Not the money, not the technique, not the technology. The trap is the community that makes it feel like a career instead of a crime. There's a moment. I think everyone who's ever done this has one, where the justification is still fresh enough to feel true, but thin enough to tear if you pull too hard. A moment where you could still stop, where the door is still open behind you and the light is still coming through, and you could turn around and walk back into the life you had. The hard, honest, painful life, and maybe be poorer, but still be whole. I had that moment. I remember it clearly. I was sitting in a room with a phone in my hand, and I had just heard a voice on the other end, a real voice, a human voice, tell me something personal, something tender, something that had clearly cost them a great deal of courage to share. And my first thought was not empathy. My first thought was, I can use this. That was the moment. Not the moment I became a scammer. That had already happened. Gradually, in stages, like water heating so slowly you don't realize you're being boiled. No, that was the moment I realized I had already changed. that the person I used to be, the one who would have heard that voice and felt something, was gone, replaced by someone who listened for weakness the way a doctor listens for a heartbeat, clinically, professionally, without feeling a thing. I didn't stop. I should have. Every moral instinct I had ever been taught, by my mother, by my teachers, by the quiet voice inside me that still knew the difference between right and wrong, was screaming at me to stop. But the money was real, and the poverty was real, and the people around me were still smiling, still building houses, still taking care of their families. And so I told myself what every person who has ever crossed a moral line tells themselves: just a little longer, just until I have enough. But just until I can stop and still survive. But enough is a horizon. The closer you walk toward it, the further it moves. And the person you were when you started, the one who promised it would only be temporary, is no longer the person making the decisions. Someone else is driving now. Someone who doesn't flinch. Someone who doesn't feel. Someone who hears a trembling voice on the phone and thinks not about the human behind it, but about what the trembling is worth. That was the justification. A scaffolding of lies, strong enough to hold the weight of what I was about to become. But scaffolding isn't structure. It's temporary. It's meant to come down. And when it did, when every excuse I had built finally collapsed under the weight of what I had done, there was nothing underneath, just me. And the silence where my conscience used to be. I never learned how to trick people. I know that sounds like a lie. I know that sounds like the kind of thing someone says when they're trying to minimize what they did. But I need you to hear me clearly. I didn't learn tricks. I learned people. And that is so much worse. There's a difference between deceiving someone and understanding them. Deception is surface. It's a fake name, a stolen photograph, a story that doesn't hold up if you press on it hard enough. Anyone can deceive. It requires nothing but dishonesty. But what I learned, what I was taught, slowly, by observation, by repetition, by sitting in rooms with people who had been doing this for years, was something deeper. I learned what makes a person open up. I learned what makes a person trust. And I learned what makes a person hand their art to a stranger and believe, truly, desperately believe, that the stranger will protect it. And then I learned how to be the kind of stranger they were looking for, not by becoming someone real, by becoming a mirror. I'm going to talk about Eleanor now, not about what was done to her, not about the method, not about the mechanics, about her, about what made her a sharp, competent, fiercely independent woman who had spent 50 years saving lives in emergency rooms, vulnerable to someone like the man she thought she was talking to. Because that's the part nobody wants to examine. Not because she did anything wrong, but because the answer is so ordinary, so universal, so deeply embedded in the human condition that it forces you to ask an uncomfortable question. Could it happen to me? Elena lost her husband after 45 years. I need you to sit with that number. 45 years. Not 5, not 10, not a relationship that started in middle age and ended with an amicable separation. 45 years of shared meals and shared beds and shared silences. 45 years of knowing someone so completely that their breathing patterns were more familiar to you than your own heartbeat. She met David when she was 24. She held his hand outside a church 2 years later and promised herself to him forever. And she kept that promise through career changes, and cross-country moves, and raising daughters, and the slow, beautiful accumulation of a life built by two people who genuinely, uncomplicatedly loved each other. Then he had a stroke. Then came the dementia. But then she watched the man who had built industrial plants across 3 continents forget the names of his own grandchildren. Then he died. And she was alone. Not just alone in a house, alone in a way that people who haven't lost a life partner cannot fully understand. Alone, the way an astronaut is alone when the tether breaks, still breathing, still conscious, still technically alive, but floating in a vastness so total that the word alone doesn't begin to cover it. 7 years. She gave herself 7 years before she even considered the possibility of connection again. 7 years of pouring everything into her grandchildren, into her work, into her dog, into the rituals and routines that keep grief from swallowing you whole. She wasn't looking for a savior. She wasn't desperate in the way people imagine. She was just tired. Tired of coming home to a house that echoed. Tired of cooking for one. Tired of watching the sun go down and knowing that no one on earth was thinking about her in that particular, intimate, daily way that a partner thinks about you. The loneliness didn't announce itself. It arrived slowly, like weather. One day, the evenings felt a little longer. One day, the silence felt a little heavier. One day, she realized that she could go an entire weekend without hearing her own name spoken aloud by someone who loved her. And that realization, quiet, devastating, profoundly ordinary, is the crack that people like me were trained to find. I want to be careful here, because I promised you I wouldn't teach. I promised I wouldn't hand you a manual, and I meant it. So I'm not going to tell you what messages were sent. I'm not going to describe the approach. I'm not going to walk you through the architecture of a conversation designed to create false intimacy. What I'm going to tell you is simpler than that and scarier. The only thing I ever really learned, the only insight that made any of this possible, is that lonely people are generous with their truth. That's it. That's the whole foundation. Not scripts, not playbooks, not psychological manipulation frameworks borrowed from intelligence agencies or sales training or anywhere else. Just a simple, devastating observation that when a person has been alone long enough, truly alone, the kind of alone where your own thoughts become both your only company and your worst enemy, they will tell you everything, not because they're foolish, because they're human. Because human beings are built for connection the way lungs are built for air. And when you've been holding your breath for 7 years, the first person who offers you oxygen gets everything. Your childhood memories, your favorite song, your fears at 3 in the morning, the way your husband used to hold your hand in the car, the ice cream flavor that reminds you of your mother. You don't even realize you're doing it. It comes out naturally, organically, in the flow of what feels like a real conversation with someone who genuinely cares. And on the other end, someone is listening, not with empathy, with inventory, cataloging every detail, every preference, every wound, building a composite of who you need them to be, and then becoming that person. Eleanor once said something that I had never been able to forget. She said, "He knew things about me that I never told anyone. My favorite color, my favorite wine, the flavor of ice cream that reminds me of being a little girl. It was like he could read my mind." She thought it was fate. She thought it was the kind of cosmic alignment that only happens once, or maybe twice. In a lifetime, she thought the universe had finally, after 7 years of grief and silence, sent her someone who understood her on a level so deep it defied explanation. She called it ESP. She called it a wavelength. She called it being made for each other. Not and the cruelest part, the part that still sits in my chest like a stone, is that she was almost right. He did know her, not through fate, not through cosmic alignment, not through any force more mysterious than patience and attention. He knew her because she had told him, piece by piece, message by message, in the natural course of conversation that she believed were intimate and reciprocal, but were actually one-sided excavation, disguised as romance. Every time she shared something personal, she thought she was building trust. She was building a cage, and she couldn't see the bars because they were made of her own words. This is the part that people don't understand. They think targeting means finding someone and attacking them. It doesn't. Targeting means listening. It means being the person who asks, "How was your day?" and actually waits for the answer. It means remembering the name of a grandchild mentioned once, 3 weeks ago, in passing. It means circling back to a story someone told you and asking a follow-up question that makes them feel, maybe for the first time in years, that someone is genuinely paying attention. That's not a technique, that's intimacy. And the horror of what I did is that I used the mechanics of real love, the listening, the remembering, the showing up, the consistency as a weapon. I took the most beautiful thing human beings do for each other and I hollowed it out and I wore it like a mask. Eleanor fell in love with a man who liked Chinese food, who appreciated good wine, who missed his late wife the way she missed David, who had a career in engineering, just like David, who was tall and kind-eyed and patient and steady. Everything she wanted, everything she needed, everything she had described, in her own words, across dozens of conversations she thought were private. She wasn't matched with a soulmate. She was matched with her own reflection. And a reflection feels real. It moves when you move. It smiles when you smile. It says all the right things because it has no substance of its own. It only exists in response to you. That's why it felt like fate. That's why it felt like ESP. That's why a woman who had spent 50 years making life and death decisions in emergency rooms, a woman who was sharper than most people half her age, looked at a phantom and saw a future because the phantom was built from her own longing. And how do you defend against something made from pieces of yourself? I think about that sometimes. Late at night, in the particular silence that finds you when you've done things you can't undo. I think about the word target. I used to use it casually. The way a salesman uses lead. The way a fisherman uses catch. Just vocabulary, just the language of the work. But a target is a person. A target is a 73-year-old woman whose feet hurt from 12-hour shifts and whose mantle holds a photograph from 1978 and whose golden retriever sleeps at her feet because he senses, the way dogs always sense, that she's carrying something too heavy for one person. A target is someone's mother, someone's grandmother, someone who just wanted to hear good morning from a voice that cared. And I was the person who made sure she heard it every day until she had nothing left. I didn't learn how to trick people. I learned what people ache for, and I became the shape of that ache, perfectly fitted. perfectly hollow. That was the real crime, not the money, the intimacy I counterfeited. Because money can be earned back, but the ability to trust, to open up, to believe that another human being might truly see you and love what they find, that's the thing I stole that can never be returned. And I knew it even then. I just didn't let myself care. There's a thing that happens to you when you do this long enough. It doesn't happen all at once. It's not a switch. It's not a dramatic moment where you look in the mirror and see someone you don't recognize. It's slower than that, quieter, rather like losing your hearing. You don't notice the silence until someone asks you a question and you realize you can't hear them anymore. That's what happened to my empathy. It didn't die, it faded. And by the time I noticed it was gone, I couldn't remember what it had felt like to have it. In the beginning, I felt things. I want you to know that. I want you to believe it, even if it's difficult, even if it's easier to imagine that people like me were born hollow, that we were always this way, that the capacity for cruelty was embedded in us from the start, like a defective gene. It wasn't. I felt things. The first time I heard a voice on the other end of a call, a real voice, not a concept, not an abstraction, but a living human being with breath and hesitation and warmth. Something inside me recoiled. This is a person. This is someone's life. This is real. I remember that feeling. I hold on to it the way you hold on to the memory of a dead friend. Not because it helps, but because forgetting would mean losing the last proof that I was once someone different. But the feeling didn't last. It couldn't. Because you can't do what I did and feel at the same time. The two are incompatible. Like holding fire and ice in the same hand. Eventually, one of them wins. And in this work, the fire always wins. The first thing that goes is their face, not literally. You never see their face. That's part of what makes it possible. They exist as text on a screen, a voice in a speaker, a name you probably invented yourself, but in the beginning, you imagined them. You hear a woman's voice crack when she talks about her late husband. And involuntarily, reflexively, your mind constructs her, sitting in a kitchen somewhere, gray hair, reading glasses, a cup of tea. She's letting go cold because she's too absorbed in talking to someone who seems to care. You see her, and seeing her makes it hard. So you learn to stop seeing. You learn to hear a voice without constructing a person behind it. You learn to read a message without wondering about the hands that typed it. You learn to process information, age, income, emotional state, level of isolation, without ever assembling those data points into a human being. They become profiles, not people, not lives, not mothers or grandfathers or widows. Profiles, sets of characteristics that predict behavior. And once that shift happens, once the person on the other end transforms from a human being into a pattern, everything becomes easier, terrifyingly easier. I used to sit in rooms with others who did the same work. We would talk, compare notes, not about methods, I won't go there, but about the people we were talking to, the ones who were close to giving, the ones who were hesitating, the ones who needed more time, and the language we used. I need you to hear this. The language we used was not the language of crime. It was the language of farming. We talked about cultivating, about harvesting, about ripe and not ready yet. Agricultural terms, growth metaphors, as if we were tending something. as if we were nurturing a process that had seasons and cycles and a natural rhythm that we were simply working in harmony with. The obscenity of that language didn't register at the time. It registers now, every single day, because what we were cultivating was a human being's trust, and what we were harvesting was the life savings. And the fact that we could dress that up in the vocabulary of honest labor, that we could sit around and discuss the destruction of someone's life the way farmers discuss rainfall, tells you everything you need to know about what this work does to the people who do it. It doesn't just damage the victims, it empties the perpetrators completely, quietly, until there's nothing left inside but mechanics. I want to tell you about a specific moment, not a method, not a tactic, a moment. I was on a call. It was late. The person on the other end was crying, not the performative, manipulative crying that I had learned to deploy when it served a purpose. Real crying, the ugly kind, the kind that comes in waves and steals your breath and leaves you gasping in the spaces between sobs. She was crying because she was afraid, not of me. She didn't know there was anything to be afraid of. She was afraid because the man she loved, the man she believed loved her, was supposedly in danger, an emergency she couldn't help with, a crisis that was unfolding thousands of miles away while she sat helpless in her living room with her dog at her feet. She was afraid for a person who didn't exist. And I listened to her cry, and I felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not guilt, not discomfort, and not even the cold efficiency of someone doing a job. Nothing. A void where a response should have been, like pressing a key on a piano and hearing no sound. I remember noticing that absence, noticing it the way you'd notice a missing tooth. Your tongue goes to the spot where something used to be and finds only empty space. I thought I should feel something right now. And then I thought, I don't. And then I continued the call. That was the moment I should have stopped. Not because I suddenly understood the harm I was causing. I had understood that for a long time, in the abstract theoretical way that allows you to acknowledge a truth without actually confronting it. I should have stopped because the absence of feeling was more terrifying than any feeling could have been. Guilt I could have lived with. Guilt is proof that your conscience is still functioning. Guilt means the moral architecture is damaged but standing. But nothing means the building is gone. Nothing means there's no foundation left to rebuild on. Nothing means you've crossed a line that doesn't have a crossing back. I started noticing other things, small things, the kind of changes that accumulate so gradually, you only recognize them in retrospect. I stopped calling my mother as often, not for any particular reason. I just didn't feel the pull, the instinct to connect, to check in, to hear a voice. The same instinct that had survived poverty and distance and years of separation was weakening. I told myself I was busy, but that wasn't it. The truth was simpler and uglier. I was losing the ability to connect. Now, not just with strangers on the other end of a phone line, but with everyone. The muscle that allows you to feel another person's presence, to care about their day, their health, their happiness, was atrophying from disuse. Because every day I practiced disconnection. Every day I rehearsed the act of engaging with a human being while feeling nothing for them. And you can't contain that. You can't compartmentalize it the way I thought I could. Empathy here, emptiness there, a clean wall between the two. It bleeds. The numbness bleeds into everything, into your friendships, into your family, into the quieter moments when you're alone and you realize that the silence inside you isn't peace, it's absence. There were days I stood in front of the mirror and tried to feel something about the person looking back. Pride, shame, anger, anything. And I couldn't. I had become so practiced at performing emotions, simulating concern, manufacturing affection, calibrating responses to achieve specific outcomes, that I could no longer distinguish between what I felt and what I performed. Was I happy? I didn't know. I knew how to sound happy. Was I sad? I didn't know. I knew what sadness looked like and how to deploy it when useful. The performance had consumed the performer. And the worst part, the part that still wakes me up at night, is that I wasn't sure it mattered. Because when you can't feel, the absence of feeling doesn't hurt. It's only later, much later, after something cracks the shell and lets the air back in, that you realize what you lost. And by then, the damage isn't just to the people you hurt, it's to you, irreversibly, permanently, to you. Eleanor once said something about the man she thought she loved. She said, he remembered everything, every little thing I told him, my favorite recipes, my grandchildren's names, the way I take my coffee. She said it with wonder, with gratitude, with the quiet amazement of a woman who had forgotten what it felt like to be seen. And the tragedy of that, the specific, precise, surgical tragedy, is that she was being seen, just not by someone who cared. She was being seen the way a mechanic sees an engine, the way an accountant sees a ledger. With attention, yes. With detail, yes. With a kind of meticulous, thorough focus that could easily be mistaken for love. But it wasn't love. It was work. And I know this because I was a kind of person who could remember everything a stranger told me, every detail, every preference, every vulnerability, and feel nothing about any of it. I had perfect recall and zero compassion. I was attentive, the way a predator is attentive. And Elena, brilliant, strong, sharp, a capable Elena, mistook that attention for devotion because she had been starving for so long that anything resembling nourishment felt like a feast. That's what I mean when I say this work empties you. It takes the tools of love, patience, attentiveness, consistency, memory, and it severs them from their purpose. It turns intimacy into a technology. And once you've done that, once you've reduced the most sacred parts of human connection to a set of operational protocols, you can never fully reassemble them. You can try. God knows I've tried. But there's always a gap, a hairline fracture running through every relationship, every conversation, every moment of genuine closeness. A whisper in the back of your mind that says, is this real? Or is this just another performance? I did that to myself. Nobody forced me. Nobody held a gun to my head. I chose to become a machine. And machines don't get to complain when they can't feel. This is the part of the story nobody warns you about. They tell you about the victims, the money lost, the lives ruined. They don't tell you what happens to the person holding the other end of the rope. They don't tell you that the rope burns both hands. They don't tell you that by the time you let go, you can't feel your fingers anymore, and you never will again. People think the danger of this life is getting caught. It isn't. The danger is the waiting, the slow, corrosive, endless, waiting for the knock on the door that may or may not come. the phone call, the message from someone you don't recognize, the car parked outside your window that wasn't there yesterday. Getting caught is an event. It happens, and then it's over. But the fear of getting caught is a condition. It lives in your chest like a second heartbeat. It follows you into sleep and waits for you when you wake up. It sits beside you at every meal, every conversation, every quiet moment that should feel safe but doesn't. Because nothing feels safe anymore. Nothing. I don't remember when the paranoia started. That's the honest truth. I can't point to a date or a conversation or a specific incident and say that's when the fear arrived. It was more like weather changing. One day the sky was clear. The next day there were clouds. And then one morning I woke up and realized the clouds had been there for weeks, and I couldn't remember what sunlight felt like. I started noticing things. A number I didn't recognize calling my phone. Probably nothing. Probably a wrong number, or a telemarketer, or someone trying to sell me something I didn't need. But maybe not. Maybe it was someone who knew. Maybe it was someone who had followed the money, traced a transaction, connected a dot that I thought was invisible. I didn't answer. I never answered unknown numbers after that. The sleep was the first thing to go. Not insomnia, not in the clinical diagnosable sense. I could fall asleep. That wasn't the problem. The problem was what waited for me when I did. I dreamed about voices, not faces, never faces. The people I had spoken to existed in my mind as sounds, tones, cadences, the particular way a person breathes when they're trying not to cry. Those sounds followed me into sleep, and they didn't fade the way normal dreams fade. They accumulated, layer upon layer, voice upon voice, a choir of people I had deceived, singing in a frequency that only I could hear. I would wake up at 3 in the morning with my jaw clenched so tight my teeth ached. I would lie in the dark and listen to my own breathing and try to convince myself that the sounds in my head were just dreams and that dreams can't hurt you. But these dreams could, because these dreams were memories. And memories don't stay in the night. They follow you into the day. They sit in the corner of every room you enter. They whisper while you're trying to eat, trying to work, trying to pretend that everything is fine. Everything was not fine. I started making mistakes, small ones at first, forgetting details I should have remembered, mixing up information that needed to stay separate, losing track of which story belonged to which person. The focus that had once felt effortless, the ability to maintain multiple conversations, multiple identities, multiple emotional registers simultaneously, was cracking. Not because I was getting careless, because I was getting tired. Tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. Tired in a way that went deeper than physical exhaustion. So tired. The kind of tired that makes you sit down in the middle of a task and stare at a wall for 20 minutes and then realize you can't remember what you were doing or why it mattered. I had spent years running on adrenaline and justification, but adrenaline doesn't last forever, and justification has a shelf life. And when both of them expire at the same time, what's left is just you sitting in a room, knowing what you are, yeah, and not being able to pretend anymore. The people around me were changing too. Not all of them. Some of them seemed fine, or at least performed fine with the same skill they applied to everything else. They laughed. They spent money. They made plans for the future as if the future were guaranteed. But others had the same look I saw in my own mirror. Hollow, not sad, not anxious, not even guilty, just hollow, like someone had reached inside them and scooped out everything that used to make them a person and left behind only the shell. We didn't talk about it. That was the unspoken rule. You don't talk about the weight. You don't mention the dreams. You don't admit that your hands shake sometimes for no reason, or that you flinch when someone says your real name because you spent so long answering to names that aren't yours. You perform normalcy the same way you perform everything else, and you hope that no one looks too closely. There was a moment, I think about it constantly, when someone I cared about asked me a simple question. Are you okay? 3 words. The most ordinary question in the world. And I opened my mouth to say yes. The automatic, reflexive yes that had become my default response to everything. And nothing came out. Not silence, not hesitation, nothing. My mouth was open and no sound emerged, and I stood there like a broken machine, trying to execute a command that no longer existed in its programming. Am I okay? I didn't know. I genuinely didn't know. Because okay requires a baseline, a reference point, a memory of what normal feels like, so you can measure the distance between there and here. And I had been so far from normal for so long that I couldn't even see it anymore. I couldn't remember what it felt like to go through a day without fear. I couldn't remember what it felt like to talk to someone without calculating. I couldn't remember what it felt like to hear a human voice and simply listen without assessing, without evaluating, without automatically sorting every word into categories of useful and not useful. I had become a machine. And now that the machine was breaking, and machines don't know how to ask for help. The fear changed shape over time. In the beginning, I was afraid of consequences, police, investigators, the legal system, and the concrete, tangible repercussions of being discovered. But as the months wore on, as the paranoia deepened and the sleep deteriorated and the numbness spread through every corner of my life, a different fear emerged, quieter, worse. I became afraid of myself, not of what I might do, but of what I had already become. I was afraid that the emptiness inside me wasn't temporary, that it wasn't a response to stress or guilt or exhaustion, that it was permanent, that the person I had been before all of this, the person who could feel, who could connect, who could sit with another human being and simply be present, was dead. Not hiding, not suppressed, dead, gone in the way that dead things are gone, completely, irrevocably, without the possibility of return. That fear was worse than any knock on any door, because a knock on the door means someone has found you. But this fear meant that even if no one ever found me, even if I lived the rest of my life without consequence, without punishment, without a single person ever knowing what I had done, I would still be trapped. Trapped inside a version of myself that couldn't feel. Trapped inside a life that looked normal from the outside, but was completely empty on the inside. Trapped in the particular hell of knowing that you destroyed something irreplaceable. Not in someone else, but in yourself. And that no amount of money or freedom or time can rebuild it. I thought about Eleanor. More often than I should have. More often than made sense. She was one voice among many. One name among dozens. One life among all the lives I had touched and damaged and walked away from. But she stayed with me. Maybe because her story was the most complete. Maybe because I had learned more about her than anyone else. Her husband, her grandchildren, her dog, the photograph on her mantle from 1978. Or maybe because she reminded me of my mother, not in appearance, not in circumstance, but in the particular kind of strength that comes from a lifetime of hard work and honest labor and showing up every single day for people who depend on you. My mother had that strength. Eleanor had that strength, and I had exploited it. I had taken the very quality that made her admirable, her willingness to trust, her capacity for love, her refusal to let grief make her cynical, and I had used it against her. I had punished her for being good, and the universe didn't stop me. Nobody stopped me. I had to stop myself. But I didn't stop. Not then. Not when I should have. I kept going because stopping meant facing what I had done, and facing what I had done meant feeling it, and feeling it. After years of numbness, after years of training myself to experience nothing, felt like it would kill me. So I kept running, not toward anything, away from everything, away from the voices in my dreams, and the hollow feeling in my chest, and the question that followed me everywhere, like a shadow with teeth. What have you become? I ran from that question for years. But here's what nobody tells you about running from yourself. You never get ahead. You never gain distance. You never find a place far enough away that the question can't reach you. Because the question isn't behind you. It's inside you. And it will wait. Patiently, quietly, without urgency, for the exact moment you stop running. And then it will ask again, louder this time, what have you become? That question broke me. Not all at once, not dramatically. It broke me the way water breaks stone, slowly, persistently, one drop at a time, until the thing that seemed unbreakable simply isn't anymore. And when I finally stopped running, when I finally turned around and faced the thing I had been fleeing, I expected to find a monster. Instead, I found something worse. I found a person, an ordinary, unremarkable person who had made choices. Small, incremental, perfectly rational choices that had led him to a place where he could listen to an old woman cry and feel nothing. That was worse than a monster, because monsters are born. But I was made, and I was made by my own hands. I don't remember the exact day I stopped. I wish I could give you that moment, the cinematic beat, the dramatic turning point where the music swells and the protagonist finally sees the light and everything changes in an instant. But that's not how it works. Not in real life. In real life, stopping is slow, ugly, unglamorous. It's not a single decision, but 1,000 small surrenders. Each one painful, each one incomplete, each one followed by the overwhelming urge to go back to the only life you know. Because at least that life had momentum. At least that life had a direction, even if the direction was downward. What I can tell you is this. There was a morning, an ordinary, forgettable morning, when I woke up and lay in bed and realized that I could not think of a single reason to get up. Not because I was depressed, not in the way people usually mean when they say that, but because every reason I had ever given myself for doing what I did had finally, completely, irreversibly collapsed. The money? I had spent most of it, not on anything that lasted, not on anything that mattered, on things designed to prove to myself and everyone around me that the work had been worth it, that the cost had been justified, that the life I was living was a success and not a slow motion catastrophe. disguised as prosperity. The family. My mother had what she needed, but she also had questions I couldn't answer, looks I couldn't meet. A son who called less and less and said less and less when he did call, because every conversation required a performance and I was running out of material. The future? What future? I had no skills that didn't depend on deception, no relationships that weren't built on lies, no version of myself that could walk into a normal life and function without the constant, exhausting machinery of pretending to be someone I wasn't. I lay in that bed and I looked at the ceiling and I understood, with a clarity so sharp it felt physical, that I had traded everything real for everything fake. And now the fake was gone and the real was gone. And all that was left was me, lying in a bed I had paid for with someone else's retirement, in a room I had furnished with someone else's grief, alone. The reckoning didn't come from the outside. No one caught me. No investigator knocked on my door. No victim confronted me on the street. The reckoning came from within. It came in the form of a question I could no longer outrun. Not, what have you done? I knew what I had done. I had always known. The knowledge was never the problem. The question was simpler, more devastating. Was it worth it? And the answer, the honest, unadorned, merciless answer, was no. It was never worth it. Not for a single second, not for a single dollar, not for any of the things I told myself I was building while I was actually dismantling, piece by piece, voice by voice, life by life, other people's worlds, and my own soul in the process. I think about Elena every day. I think about the photograph on her mantle, the one from 1978. You're the young woman with dark curly hair and a tall man with kind eyes, standing outside a church and are holding hands and promising each other forever. I think about the fact that they kept that promise for 45 years. 45 years of ordinary, imperfect, beautiful love. And then he got sick. And then he forgot her name. And then he died. And she, this extraordinary woman who had spent half a century saving lives in emergency rooms, was left alone with a golden retriever and a house full of memories and a loneliness so vast it swallowed the horizon. And she made the mistake, the completely understandable, profoundly human mistake, of believing that love might find her again. And instead of love, she found me, or someone like me, someone who heard her loneliness and saw not a person to comfort, but a vulnerability to exploit. Someone who listened to her talk about David, his kind eyes, his engineering mind, his steady hands, and thought, not what a beautiful love story, but I know exactly what she's looking for. Someone who took the shape of her dead husband's ghost and held it out to her, like a gift, and watched her reach for it with both hands. And then charged her $600,000 for the privilege of holding smoke. I need to say this clearly, without metaphor, without poetry, without the protective distance of narrative craft. What I did was wrong, completely, unequivocally, irredeemably wrong. There is no justification. There is no context that makes it acceptable. There is no backstory sad enough, no poverty deep enough, or no systemic failure vast enough to excuse the deliberate, sustained, calculated destruction of another person's trust. I knew what I was doing. I knew who I was hurting. I knew that the money I was taking wasn't coming from some abstract pool of first world wealth, but from specific individual human beings who had earned every dollar through decades of honest work. Nurses who worked 12-hour shifts. Teachers who spent their own money on classroom supplies. retirees who had saved carefully, responsibly, for a future that was supposed to be safe. I took from them, not because I had to, because I chose to. And that choice, that ongoing, daily, renewed choice, is something I will carry for the rest of my life, not as a lesson, as a scar. I want to talk to you directly now, not as a narrator, not as a character in a story, not as a voice performing remorse for an audience, as a person who did terrible things and is trying, imperfectly, inadequately, probably too late, to do something that is not terrible. If you are watching this and you recognize yourself in any part of my story, not the scam, but the loneliness, the vulnerability, the quiet desperation for connection, I need you to hear me. You are not stupid. You are not weak. You are not a fool. You are a human being. And human beings need love the way they need oxygen. And when you've been deprived of it long enough, you will reach for anything that resembles it, even if some part of you suspects it isn't real. That's not a character flaw. That's biology. That's the fundamental architecture of what it means to be alive and social and wired for connection in a world that is increasingly brutally isolating. The people who exploit that wiring, people like I was, are counting on your shame. They are counting on the fact that when it's over, when the money is gone and the truth is exposed, you will be too embarrassed to tell anyone, too humiliated to report it, too broken to fight back. Your silence is their greatest weapon. Don't give it to them. And if you're watching this and you know someone, a parent, a grandparent, an aunt, a friend who lives alone, call them. Not tomorrow, now. Not because you think they're being scammed, not because you suspect something is wrong, but because loneliness is the unlocked door that these predators walk through. And the best lock in the world is a voice on the other end of the phone that says, I was just thinking about you. How are you? Tell me about your day. That's it. That's the whole defense. Connection. Real connection. The kind that doesn't cost anything and doesn't require anything and doesn't have an agenda. Just presence. Just love. Just showing up. I can't undo what I did. I've accepted that. The money Ilana lost is gone. The years she spent believing in a phantom are gone. The trust she had in her own judgment, the quiet confidence of a woman who had made split-second life and death decisions for 50 years, is damaged in ways that may never fully heal. I can't fix that. No apology is large enough. No confession is complete enough. No story told to any audience, no matter how vast, can restore what was taken. But I can do this. I can sit here and tell the truth, not the comfortable truth, not the version that makes me sympathetic or redeemable or worthy of forgiveness. The real truth, which is that I was ordinary and I made choices, and those choices destroyed lives, and the lives they destroyed were lived by people who deserved better, people who had worked harder than I ever did, people who had loved more honestly than I ever have, people who asked nothing from the world except the chance to not be alone. And I took that from them for money that's gone now, for money that bought nothing that lasted, for money that cost everything that mattered. If you think scammers are monsters, you're wrong. And that's the most terrifying part of this story. We're not monsters. We're ordinary people. People with mothers and childhoods and memories of being good. People who started out with the same moral instincts as everyone else. The same capacity for empathy. The same understanding of right and wrong. The same quiet inner voice that says, this is not who you are. We heard that voice. We just stopped listening. One day at a time, one choice at a time, one voice on the other end of the phone at a time, until the person we used to be was gone, and the person who replaced them could listen to an old woman cry about her dead husband and feel nothing, absolutely nothing. That's not a monster. That's something worse. That's a human being who chose deliberately, repeatedly, with full knowledge of what they were doing, to stop being human. Eleanor is still working at 73, still doing 12-hour shifts in an emergency room, still saving lives, still paying off loans that she took out to send money to a man who never existed. She will probably work until she can't anymore. Not because she wants to, because people like me took her retirement, her savings, her future, the quiet, comfortable years she had earned through half a century of service to strangers who needed her. And even now, even after everything, she said something that I will never deserve to have heard. She said, I don't want anyone else to go through what I went through. Not anger, not vengeance, compassion. After everything that was done to her, her first instinct was to protect someone else. That's the difference between us. That's the distance between who she is and who I was. A distance I will spend the rest of my life trying to cross, knowing I probably never will. This is where I leave you, not with a lesson, not with a morale, not with a comfortable resolution that stories are supposed to provide, with a silence. The same silence that fills Eleanor's house when the dog is asleep and the phone isn't ringing, and the photographs on the mantle are just photographs, and the evening stretches out ahead of her like a road with no destination. That silence is where the scammers live. In the space between your loved one's pride and their pain. In the gap between what they need and what they're willing to ask for. In the quiet, unbearable loneliness that they will never, ever tell you about. Listen for it before someone else does. If you're still here, if you stayed through all of this, then you already understand. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Not for me, for the woman with the photograph on her mantle, for the nurse who is still working at 73, for every person sitting alone right now, holding a phone, hoping that the voice on the other end is real. Be the real voice before it's too late.